Is North Korea truly isolated, technically speaking? Although the Korean War has been suspended since 1953, a formal peace treaty was never signed, only a mere armistice agreement. This armistice without war situation has lasted for over 7 decades, creating a risky environment where Cold War tensions are always simmering, capable of erupting into a military conflict at any moment. In such a scenario, both sides would seek every possible advantage. While South Korea can rely on steadfast support from the United States and other allies, the question arises, who can North Korea, a nation considered one of the most diplomatically isolated in the world and dubbed the Hermit Kingdom, count on for assistance? Surprisingly, a new international partner recently openly allied with North Korea, the Russian Federation. In June 2024, a landmark agreement, the Treaty on Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, was signed between the two countries. This event was quite shocking, as Russia had previously supported sanctions aimed at curbing North Korea's nuclear program. However, this new treaty explicitly states that each party will provide aid to the other in the event of an armed attack by a hostile power. This relationship isn't entirely new. In fact, the first alliance between North Korea and Russia, then the Soviet Union, was formed by a 1961 treaty, and the current agreement shares many linguistic similarities. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, that treaty was replaced by a much less binding arrangement in 2000. But the 2024 treaty now promises direct military intervention. Notably, North Korea has already been indirectly involved in Russia's military efforts for some time. Pyongyang has provided large quantities of artillery shells and rockets to supplement Russia's supplies in the war in Ukraine. More recently, they've transferred more advanced weapons, including self-propelled artillery, multiple launch rocket systems, MLRS, and short-range ballistic missiles. While the commitment to mutual support might appear sincere, international analysts suggest there could be deeper motives behind this decision. Russia seems to be seeking military supplies from North Korea to sustain its military campaign in Ukraine. Conversely, North Korea is receiving a significant increase in trade, including food, raw materials, and rubles, all essential for a cash-strapped nation. Western experts are still speculating whether Russia would genuinely defend this Hermit Kingdom in the event of a conflict, or if this alliance is merely a temporary tool to achieve immediate objectives. Russia's primary motivation might be the need for ammunition and weapon systems that have been expended in the Ukraine conflict. However, if these stockpiles run out, the benefits of maintaining the agreement could significantly diminish. The treaty also clarifies that military intervention would only be approved in a defensive war against an aggressor, and not if North Korea initiates hostilities. Furthermore, there are enough legalistic loopholes allowing each nation to avoid getting drawn into conflict under certain circumstances, particularly provisions related to military action being consistent with the national laws of each respective country. This provides a convenient and sufficiently vague loophole to avoid being pulled into a foreign war with what appears to be an ally of convenience. Should a conflict actually erupt on the Korean Peninsula, whether Russia would intervene directly remains a difficult question to answer. The majority of Russia's military is engaged in fighting thousands of miles away in Ukraine. and Moscow would likely want to avoid a two-front war if possible. This could lead them to seek ways to sidestep the conflict. In this context, North Korea would likely seek assistance from a more traditional and steadfast ally, China. Since its founding, North Korea has heavily relied on military aid from China. During the Korean War, Chinese troops directly participated in the fighting, pushing back UN forces on the peninsula. Since the armistice was signed, China has consistently been North Korea's closest ally and most important trade partner. This relationship was formalized in a treaty signed in 1961. The close ties between China and North Korea stem from their shared communist governments as well as their common land border, providing both ideological and pragmatic reasons for their alliance. However, this relationship has faced numerous strains in recent years. One of North Korea's key economic policies is juche, or self-reliance, which is by nature an internationally alienating policy. This is further complicated by China's efforts to increase its international trade with both South Korea and the United States, two nations that have the most antagonistic relationships with North Korea. Although China still maintains a policy of mutual defense and cooperation with North Korea, this has been tested by Pyongyang's aggressive saber-rattling and provocations. Things came to a head in 2006 after a North Korean nuclear weapon test, which led China, a more internationally minded nation, to support UN sanctions. As recently as 2017, China even imposed unilateral sanctions on North Korea as a punitive measure for its missile and nuclear programs. While the two nations reconciled and renewed their defensive pact in 2021, China remains highly cautious about the risk of being drawn into a conflict. China is heavily focused on trade and expanding its economy. Becoming entangled in a war on behalf of a foreign nation is something they wish to avoid at all costs. Any renewed fighting in Korea would undoubtedly involve the United States, China's largest trading partner. Beijing has clearly stated that it would only protect North Korea if it is attacked first, and would sit out any fight that began with North Korean aggression. China wants to avoid the complexities that a renewed Korean war would bring, such as economic difficulties, sanctions, and an inevitable refugee crisis. Preventing Pyongyang from taking rash actions is a top priority, and Beijing is willing to use the leverage of providing 90 to 98% of North Korea's foreign trade to maintain peace and stability in the region. While Russia and China are undoubtedly North Korea's most significant allies, there are some other nations that might offer assistance if North Korea were attacked. Surprisingly, North Korea has actually intervened to support other nations in the past. The question is whether these actions would be reciprocated. Iran could be North Korea's next potential ally. Both nations have strained relations with the United States and other Western powers, creating a common enemy. They have also exchanged scientists and engineers to collaborate on their respective missile and nuclear capabilities. However, the extent of their relationship ends there. There is no formal treaty binding the two countries, and Iran has its own geopolitical objectives, not wanting to be drawn into a war 4,000 miles away. Therefore, beyond the shared benefit of mutual enemies, there's little reason or opportunity for Iran to intervene. During the Vietnam War, North Korea sent approximately 1,000 soldiers and several pilots to aid their fellow communists against their South Vietnamese and American adversaries. It's also believed that some North Vietnamese army soldiers were trained in North Korea. However, today, the relationship between the two nations is strained, especially after Vietnam implemented economic reforms and began diplomatic relations with South Korea. Consequently, it's unlikely Vietnam would get involved if North Korea were invaded. Syria has collaborated with North Korea, with allegations that North Korea helped with Syria's missile and chemical weapons development. There are also reports that North Korean soldiers participated in the recent Syrian civil war on behalf of Bashar al-Assad, though this was denied and difficult to confirm. With the country ravaged by the aftermath of a civil war and Assad's overthrow, it's highly unlikely they would aid North Korea. North Korea also developed good relationships with Egypt and Libya, sending military advisors and Air Force personnel to Egypt during the Yom Kippur War in 1973, and having a defense pact with Hosni Mubarak. They also had a similar arrangement with Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi. North Korea has sold weapons to both nations. However, both countries have experienced recent internal strife and are unlikely to be able to send any meaningful aid to help their North Korean allies. Although it's one of the most politically isolated nations on the planet, North Korea has tried to expand its influence into Africa. They have traded weapons and sent military and police advisors to Madagascar, Benin, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Nigeria, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. While undoubtedly grateful for the assistance, these African nations would be unlikely to get involved in a conflict on the other side of the planet. Many of them also fall under China's sphere of influence and would take their cues from Beijing rather than Pyongyang. Other nations that have had or still maintain friendly diplomatic relationships with North Korea include Cuba, Bulgaria, and Pakistan. However, the political, economic, and military realities each of these nations faces make any intervention in Korea highly unlikely. It's also worth noting that North Korea once had a very close relationship with Yugoslavia, but this is no longer a relevant factor.